Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. Marque, Texas, October 21st, 2020. Just after sunrise, patrol units were dispatched to a single-story home on a quiet residential street. The neighborhood, built for predictability and calm, was about to become a crime scene. Inside, first responders located a 30-year-old woman in the master bathroom, unresponsive, with visible trauma consistent with a firearm discharge. Emergency medical personnel attempted life-saving measures on scene, but the injuries were incompatible with survival. From the very first minutes, investigators began treating the house as a primary scene. Perimeter tape was deployed. Entry points were documented. The master bath was immediately isolated. This was the confirmed locus of the shooting, and every square inch of it would be examined. A semi-automatic pistol magazine lay on the tile floor. Several spent shell casings were recovered in close proximity to the victim. Patterns in the blood spatter were photographed before any movement of the body. Detectives moved quickly to secure potential sources of digital evidence. Surveillance canvassing began with doorbell cameras on adjacent properties, traffic cameras at the subdivision's entrance, and any private security systems within a 2-block radius. Crime scene technicians collected the victim's cell phone from the vanity counter. The device was powered down and placed in a Faraday bag to prevent remote access or deletion of data. The initial sweep yielded no signs of forced entry. That fact, coupled with the location of the victim, an interior bathroom, suggested she had retreated or been cornered rather than surprised by an external intruder. In domestic homicide investigations, that distinction is significant. Autopsy authorization was issued within hours. Yet the medical examiner's office assigned a senior forensic pathologist to the case, noting the proximity of the shot patterns to the victim's body. Ballistic analysis would later determine whether all recovered casings came from the same weapon and whether any bullet fragments could be matched to a specific firearm make and model. While uniformed officers maintained scene security, lead investigators began reconstructing the last known movements of the victim. Witness statements were prioritized from immediate family, neighbors who had been home at the time, and any recent visitors to the property. Early accounts indicated the victim had recently discussed separation from her spouse, a detail logged as relationship stressor in the case file. However, no public identification of a suspect was made during those opening hours. By the end of the first day, the case had moved from a medical emergency to a confirmed homicide investigation. The bathroom remained sealed under police evidence tape. The rest of the house was photographed in situ before any property was released back to next of kin. Every item within the perimeter, from personal effects to stray fibers, was now potential evidence. What investigators did not yet know was that the search for whoever pulled the trigger would extend far beyond Marque, and that their initial contact with a person of interest would not end the threat. In any homicide investigation, knowing what happened in the minutes before the act is only part of the job. Equally critical is understanding what was in motion in the days, weeks, and months before the first round was fired. That was the focus as Marque detectives moved past the initial crime scene processing and began building the broader picture of Savannah Pascal's life. The victim's immediate background was straightforward on paper: 30 years old, Texas native, no criminal history, mother of 2. But the personal timeline investigators were assembling told a more complex story. Financial records pulled under court order showed recent activity consistent with preparing for a household split. Separate bank transactions, withdrawals into a personal account, and payments made to a rental property management company. Witness canvassing expanded beyond the immediate neighbors. Co-workers confirmed that Savannah had taken time off in early October and had been talking openly about making a change at home. Friends described her as careful with her words, but one noted that she seemed on edge in the days leading up to her death. These statements were documented and cross-referenced for consistency, each assigned an interview code in the case log. Detectives also pursued the digital trail. The contents of her phone, secured in a Faraday bag on scene, were cloned for analysis. Messaging history in the week before the shooting included multiple exchanges with a family member about feeling unsafe and wanting to sort things out without a blow-up. Those messages would later be important in establishing state of mind, a key factor in both charging and trial strategy. Security footage collection was methodical. From subdivision entry cameras, officers could confirm the victim's vehicle movements in the 48 hours prior to the incident. No irregular travel patterns were noted. Private home surveillance from across the street showed the victim returning home on the evening of October 20th and not leaving again. This locked the time frame. Whatever occurred in that bathroom happened between the early morning hours and the time the 911 call was placed. Forensic specialists examined interior entry points, the front door, back door, and garage access for tool marks or forced entry signs. None were found. This aligned with the initial on-scene observation and strengthened the working theory that the shooter was someone with legitimate access to the residence. While the evidence was stacking toward a domestic-related motive, lead investigators kept the official language neutral in reports and press briefings. The case was still in its earliest phase, and premature conclusions could compromise both the investigation and eventual prosecution. One detective remarked during a case meeting, "The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem." In other words, the absence of chaos in the entry points and the victim's predictable movements meant that the shooter had control over when and where the encounter would happen. A detail that would influence both the tactical analysis and the legal theory of premeditation. By the end of this phase, the investigative team had mapped a coherent pre-incident timeline, a victim preparing for separation, no sign of random intrusion, and an increasingly narrow suspect pool. But there was still no public naming of any individual. The work ahead would focus on connecting these background findings to the physical and digital evidence recovered from the scene. By day 3, the case moved from stabilizing a homicide scene to locating a person who had already put distance between himself and Marque. In an investigation like this, time works against accuracy. Witness memory degrades, digital traces get overwritten, and a suspect who is not yet in custody can reset the board. The team's objective changed from documenting what happened inside a bathroom to managing a moving threat. The first major development was digital. Within hours of Savannah Pascal's death, a self-recorded video began circulating among contacts linked to the family. The file featured a man in a parked vehicle addressing 2 children directly. The tone was personal, the statements framed as final, and the time reference aligned with the morning of the homicide. Detectives treated it as potential evidence of state of mind and intent. They secured the original file from a primary recipient, logged it under a unique evidence number, and generated cryptographic hashes to confirm integrity for court. Chain of custody forms captured who collected it, when it was collected, and where it was stored. Analysts pulled basic metadata and compared it to what could be confirmed independently: creation time, modification time, device type if available, and any residual geodata. Where the file did not contain reliable GPS coordinates, the team used secondary indicators. Audio technicians isolated ambient noise, heavy vehicle pass-bys at irregular intervals, a sustained low-frequency hum consistent with a nearby highway, and short bursts that sounded like a tractor trailer braking. That profile suggested recording near a traffic corridor rather than a residential cul-de-sac. It did not put a pin on a map, but it narrowed the probable path out of Galveston County. At the same time, the physical search expanded along the likely travel routes. Patrol units received a bolo on the vehicle believed to be involved after the shooting. Automated license plate readers and toll readers were queried for hits. An early return showed a read consistent with the bolo heading north out of the county shortly after the estimated time of death. Investigators coordinated with adjacent jurisdictions to quietly monitor major interchanges without broadcasting details that could compromise a later prosecution. Back at the lab, the video's visual details were cataloged: clothing layers, a partial reflection in the windshield, and the background silhouette of a building edge gave the analysts reference points. Technicians compared stills from the recording to frames captured on neighborhood cameras earlier that morning. The match was not a full identification, but the clothing characteristics were consistent. That connection gave the team a bridge. The person in the video and the person seen near the residence before and after the homicide appeared to be the same. Investigators kept the contents of the video out of public briefings. In a case with potential domestic motives and minor children, reckless disclosure can damage both the legal case and the people most affected. The file stayed sealed. What changed internally was priority. The man in the video needed to be located under safe conditions. and any vehicle under his control needed to be secured for trace evidence before it could be altered, detailed, or sold. On October 22nd, Harris County deputies responded to a report of a suspicious vehicle matching the bolo. The approach followed felony stop protocol, units positioned to cover, commands issued clearly. A male inside matched the description circulated among investigators. The contact escalated quickly. A deputy fired, striking the subject in the upper torso. Medical aid was immediate. The man was transported under guard to a trauma center. Hospital security was notified of custodial status. A detective drafted a sworn probable cause statement for the on-call magistrate so that once medically cleared, the subject could be booked without delay. To preserve the evidentiary value of what was inside the vehicle, deputies secured it for a search warrant rather than conducting a broad exploratory search roadside. The exterior was photographed. The interior was photographed from all angles, and the doors were sealed with evidence tape. Standard risk items, any visible weapons, ammunition, or contraband, were removed under safety exceptions and logged separately. Once the warrant issued, crime scene technicians collected clothing and personal effects for later testing. Gunshot residue sampling kits were readied for hands and clothing, bearing in mind that results can be affected by elapsed time and medical treatment. While the subject remained hospitalized, the case team split effort across 5 lanes: scene forensics, digital forensics, interview scheduling, legal paperwork, and victim services. Scene forensics continued with ballistic comparisons. The casings recovered from the bathroom floor were entered into the national database to check for prior associations. Any bullet fragments recovered during autopsy would be compared to rifling characteristics if a firearm was later seized. Digital forensics moved from the victim's phone to a broader data environment: call detail records, cloud backups associated with the victim's number, and legally obtained logs that could anchor the morning timeline minute by minute. Interview scheduling prioritized those who saw the victim in the 48 hours before the homicide, aiming to lock in a consistent sequence of events without leading questions or repetition. Legal paperwork covered charging decisions and a bond posture memo. The facts as they stood supported a murder charge. Prosecutors coordinated with investigators on the initial draft, anticipating defense challenges to the video's admissibility and to any statements collected while the subject received medical care. The hospital phase can introduce complications, pain medication, capacity questions, and questions about whether any statements are voluntary. To avoid creating suppression issues, detectives limited contact to necessary identification and deferred substantive questioning until counsel could be present. Victim services made direct contact with the family. Their role is not investigative. It is to explain the process, assist with immediate needs, and connect relatives to resources. Cases like this, domestic, lethal, sudden, leave families with gaps that no arrest can fill. In towns like Marque, murders aren't just crimes. They tear at the fabric of a quiet community. Late in the day, analysts reported a small but important convergence. The apparel seen in the video, down to a distinctive seam and logo placement, aligned with what the subject was wearing during the Harris County encounter. That mattered. If trace evidence on those garments later linked back to the bathroom, it would tighten the chain from scene to suspect to custody. Separately, the toll system read was now supported by a second sensor farther up the corridor, establishing directionality. The travel corridor, the video-audio profile, and the recovery location in Harris County were now pointing the same way. The team avoided overreach. They did not claim the video proved the act. They did not claim the audio put the vehicle at a specific mile marker. They did not release names into the public narrative at this stage. The case file stated only what could be defended. A self-produced recording existed. It was made within hours of the homicide. Its content addressed 2 children directly, and the person in that recording matched, by clothing and physical characteristics, the person contacted by deputies. That night, 2 practical decisions framed the next moves. First, the clothing and items seized from the vehicle would be shipped under seal to the lab as soon as the warrant return was complete. Second, the investigative team prepared a bond argument anticipating that upon medical release, the subject would present a flight risk. The video, the attempted movement out of the jurisdiction, and the seriousness of the charge would factor into that request. Before midnight, one of the lead detectives wrote a line in the daily summary that captured the tension. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. a bathroom homicide with no forced entry, a video with personal statements recorded hours later, a suspect located in another county by day 2. Clean lines can mislead if you sprint to the finish. The job was to keep building without assuming the conclusion. If you're following this case in real time, the question is simple. When a recording speaks directly to a family, should investigators treat it as a roadmap or as a variable to be tested against every other piece of evidence? The Harris County contact moved the file from a regional search to custodial management. The subject found by deputies was stabilized at a trauma center and placed in custodial status. Detectives limited interaction to identity confirmation. Anything substantive would wait for counsel. The goal was clean paperwork, preserved evidence, and a frictionless handoff from hospital to jail once physicians cleared transport. Prosecutors prepared a sworn probable cause affidavit grounded in verifiable items. The Marque bathroom scene, photographed and logged ballistic evidence, the victim's device extraction showing imminent separation plans, neighborhood surveillance aligning with a matching figure, toll LPR hits establishing a northbound path, and a self-recorded video produced within hours of the homicide. The affidavit quoted only what was necessary to prove relevance and timing. A murder charge issued after magistrate review. At first appearance, the court addressed release. In violent felonies, the calculus is statutory: offense severity, case strength, criminal history, community ties, and flight risk. The state emphasized a fatal domestic incident, immediate movement out of the originating county, and a recording made within the charging window. Defense leaned on injury, medical recovery, and presumption of innocence. The court ordered pretrial release with electronic monitoring and strict conditions. A GPS ankle device was fitted, geofences programmed, and tamper-loss low battery alerts enabled. Pretrial services briefed compliance rules and logged the defendant's acknowledgments. Investigatively, custody didn't end the build, it reset it. Search warrants targeted the defendant's residences and vehicles. Items authorized by the orders, clothing, footwear, and any firearm-related materials were seized under chain of custody. The lab queue prioritized independent anchors, casing to firearm comparisons if a gun was recovered, fragment to rifling if available, DNA touch DNA where appropriate, and particulate transfers connecting garments to bathroom surfaces. The lab needed complete seals, clear labels, and clean swabs, not narrative. The medical examiner advanced the clinical track. External and internal exams documented entry and trajectory consistent with a close-range interior shooting. Standard toxicology was ordered. The preliminary summary stuck to clinical facts. Manner of death as firearm homicide was not in dispute, and the report's neutrality was preserved for court. Compliance monitoring began the day of release. The device showed expected pings. Gaps had to be justified by coverage issues rather than manipulation. Supervising officers verified residence data, performed check-ins, and audited the unit's health reports. Prosecutors filed protective notices, no contact terms, witness advisements, and scheduling to keep the case insulated from unnecessary exposure. With minor children in the family system, victim services staff provided plain language updates and resources. Predictability matters when everything else feels unstable. The video remained sealed. Anticipating challenges to authenticity and prejudice, the state documented integrity at each step. The original file and its forensic copy received cryptographic hashes. Any enhancement carried a derivative hash and a transformation log. Discovery proceeded on a measured cadence. Scene photos, evidence logs, witness summaries, extraction reports, and expert notices were disclosed under rule while sensitive leads stayed compartmentalized. From outside the courthouse, pretrial release after a lethal domestic incident can look like institutional failure. Inside, it is constitutional structure, temporary liberty with enforceable controls. The technology is the hinge. When it works, it records compliance in real time. When it fails, risk escalates quickly. Across agencies, the homicide anchor never moved. Marque detectives cross-checked Harris County custodial property lists, hospital timestamps, and intake clothing descriptors against their own evidence logs. Small consistencies, duplicate times on treatment records, matching apparel notes, monitoring onboarding receipts, are what keep a case resilient when motions and cross-examination arrive. On paper, the status at close of chapter looks stable. Charge filed, conditions set, monitoring active, labs working, families informed. Experience says stability can be temporary when a defendant still has choices. The difference between a controlled pretrial and a crisis often starts with a single tamper alert. Pretrial release changed the pace but not the stakes. After the hospital discharge and first appearance, the defendant was fitted with an ankle monitoring device and released under court-ordered conditions. The homicide charge out of Marque did not pause. It shifted into a phase where supervision, reporting, and forensic follow-through had to work in parallel. In cases like this, the calendar becomes as important as the case file. Missed pings, missed check-ins, or missed hearings are not clerical errors. They are risk signals. Monitoring began the day of release. The device logged location at regular intervals, flagged low battery conditions, and recorded any event suggesting tampering. Pretrial services maintained the dashboard. Supervising officers reviewed overnight reports, verified residence details, and documented any deviations allowed by the court for medical appointments, council meetings, or employment searches. The unit's health, battery, strap circuit, GPS reception was tracked in real time. If an alert fired, the protocol was simple: confirm the device status, call the defendant, and escalate to law enforcement if the contact failed or the data showed a cut strap. Meanwhile, the investigative build continued. Search warrant returns from earlier seizures were arriving at the lab. Clothing and footwear collected under warrant were examined for trace materials that could tie back to the Marque bathroom. Microscopic particulates, DNA where appropriate, and comparisons between known standards and what was recovered on scene. Ballistic work advanced on its own timetable. Cartridge casings from the bathroom were entered for correlation. If a firearm later surfaced, test fires would be compared to recovered fragments and rifling characteristics. The medical examiner finalized the clinical path, documenting injuries consistent with a close-range interior shooting and issuing the formal cause and manner of death. Discovery moved as the rules required. The state disclosed what it would rely on: scene photographs, evidence logs, summaries of witness interviews, digital extraction reports, and noticed expert testimony without previewing opinions outside what the science supported. The self-produced recording remained sealed. Prosecutors anticipated admissibility challenges and preserved file integrity with hash values for the original and all forensic copies, logging every enhancement step and export. Court is not a place for surprises. It is a place for records. For Savannah's family, the legal steps were necessary but insufficient. Victim services stayed in regular contact, translating procedures without legal jargon and making sure protective orders and no-contact conditions were understood and enforced. When a homicide involves minor children, updates are both practical and protective. A steady timeline is a form of respect. It doesn't repair anything, but it prevents new harm. From the outside, supervised release after a fatal domestic shooting can look like a contradiction. From the inside, it is constitutional practice. Presumed innocence balanced with community safety, enforced by conditions a judge believes are meaningful. The tool here was a strap and a set of geofences. When it works, compliance is documented quietly. When it fails quickly. Weeks on supervision passed under watch but without incident of record. Court dates were scheduled. Counsel conferred. Motions practice began in the background. Investigators kept their file anchored to the original scene. Reports out of Marque cross-referenced every new lab receipt and every interview synopsis back to the bathroom. The case remained one story: a homicide in a residence, a defendant on bond, evidence still being processed, a prosecution being prepared. The reality of GPS supervision is that it is both powerful and limited. It generates data. It does not guarantee behavior. Most defendants comply, attend hearings, and return home at night under the conditions imposed. But the system also expects and plans for the moment when compliance ends. Supervising officers are trained to treat the first sign of tampering as an emergency, because that is what it is. The moment came on April 13, 2021. The alert did not arrive with drama. It arrived as data. The monitoring platform recorded a strap circuit break. The unit stopped reporting valid location. Attempts to contact the defendant failed. Per protocol, pretrial services escalated to law enforcement and documented the sequence: time of alert, call attempts, last known coordinates, and the moment the device fell offline. What had been a managed risk became an active flight risk in minutes. The court file moved just as quickly. A motion to revoke bond and issue a warrant was prepared with the tamper report attached. Supervising officers prepared a compliance summary for the judge. Installation date, last verified check-in, geofence parameters, and the alert timeline. The state's position was straightforward. Conditions had been broken. The defendant needed to be taken back into custody. Local agencies circulated a bolo. The homicide anchor never shifted. Every notice referenced the Marque case, the pending murder charge, and the supervision breach. Interagency coordination ramped up. Marque detectives notified regional partners and shared the most recent lawful identifiers, physical description, any vehicles previously linked to the defendant, and the last confirmed contact points. Because GPS was offline, the search started the old-fashioned way. Visits to known addresses, checks with employers or landlords, quiet inquiries to relatives through appropriate channels, and scrutiny of immediate financial activity. Investigators requested rapid reviews of any recent cash withdrawals, pawnshop transactions, and short-term lodging attempts. When electronic supervision disappears, the first hours matter most. The narrative here does not split. It tightens. A homicide case that had been preparing for court converted into a fugitive case tied to that same homicide file. The same evidence, the same charge, the same victim. The room in Marque remained the anchor. Nothing about the story changed except the status of the person charged. Teams worked their lists into the evening. Patrol briefings included the photograph now associated publicly with the defendant. Dispatch centers flagged any name or plate matches for immediate officer safety awareness. The guidance was clear. Approach with caution, notify investigators, and do not jeopardize bystander safety in an improvised pursuit. The case needed recovery, not a second scene. As the day closed, a detective added a short line to the case log. Revocation packet filed, BOLO active, awaiting leads. In practical terms, that meant every agency watching the network could now act the moment a credible tip landed. It also meant the calculus for public safety had changed. A supervised defendant was now an unsupervised one. People in these systems learned to read the difference between noise and signal. A tamper alert is not noise. There's a human truth worth stating plainly. Accountability is not a feeling. It is a set of actions. A community can hold two facts at once, that the Constitution requires fairness and that safety requires urgency when fairness is abused. Cases like this force that balance into public view. The process designed to be careful must also be fast. The next chapter in this timeline begins where the alert left off, with a multi-jurisdiction search accelerating and a single decision made far from a courthouse, a decision that will move the case from supervision into pursuit. The Marque homicide case did not split when the ankle strap went dark, it accelerated. On April 13, 2021, the monitoring platform registered a tamper event and then silence. Pretrial services documented the sequence, notified the court, and forwarded the alert data to investigators. A bond revocation motion and warrant moved within hours. The file remained the same. One victim, one charge, one case that now required a fugitive track. The first day after the alert was logistics and containment. Detectives verified last known locations, called listed numbers, and checked the address provided to pretrial. Nothing answered. Patrol briefings carried the custodial photograph and a caution flag. The state's motion package summarized compliance history, the precise time of the strap break, and the loss of reporting. It asked for immediate authority to take the defendant back into custody on site. The judge signed. By midweek, a new felony entered the timeline. At a local auto dealership, a man matching the defendant's description requested a test drive. During the drive, he displayed a knife, ordered the employee out, and left in the dealership's Chevrolet Tahoe. The employee reported the robbery immediately. The plate went into the network. That incident, separate from the murder charge, mattered for two reasons. It showed capability and intent to obtain a long-range vehicle, and it provided a moving target with a VIN and a registration history investigators could track across jurisdictions. The Tahoe became evidence the moment it was reported stolen. Alerts hit plate readers and highway cameras. When the vehicle was eventually located, procedures were standard. Photograph in place, tow to a secure bay, preserve latent prints, collect touch DNA from high-contact areas, swab steering wheel, shift selector, interior handles, bag any loose items under seal, and log each step for court. If the recovery location had surveillance, video requests followed. If the recovery involved a private lot, consent and warrants were handled with the same caution as the homicide scene. The goal was to add traceable links, not introduce avoidable challenges for the prosecution. With a violent felony warrant now active and a fresh robbery report, U.S. Marshals joined the hunt. Their role is straightforward: locate and arrest fugitives. They requested the full identifiers package, reviewed last known device data, and pulled any recent financial moves that could indicate travel: cash withdrawals, quick sell pawn activity, motel payments, short-term phone activations. Local detectives provided context on the homicide. The Marque bathroom remained the anchor, the charge was murder, and the defendant had already demonstrated the ability to cross county lines quickly. This was not a dragnet, it was a narrowing operation. ALPR systems along major corridors returned periodic hits that suggested an eastbound trajectory. Toll records supported movement away from Galveston County. Where the trail went cold, the marshals worked the space between sensors: truck stops, cash-only motels, self-storage lots, and RV parks where a vehicle can blend. Agencies along the Gulf states were briefed. Officer safety notes emphasized the prior encounter in Harris County, where the defendant had been injured during contact. The instruction was clear: coordinate, contain, do not force an unsafe stop. The digital team kept the case from fragmenting. They mapped tips against known timelines, rejected outliers, and fed only corroborated leads to the field units. They also handled the inevitable rumor volume that follows a public bolo. A responsible manhunt balances speed with accuracy. Each false lead costs time and endangers people who happen to fit a description. The case remained disciplined because the target did not change: bring a homicide defendant back to face the Texas charge. Family outreach did not stop. Victim services staff communicated each procedural step to Savannah's relatives: what a revocation meant, how interstate coordination works, what to expect next. They did not speculate. You don't promise capture, you promise effort and transparency. In towns like Marque, murders aren't just crimes, they alter how neighbors think about safety. Keeping a community informed is part of the work. As the weeks progressed, a pattern formed. The suspect avoided places that required government ID and gravitated toward cash transactions. That is common in flight cases. It doesn't make a person invisible, it just changes which systems can see them. Where credit cards won't speak, cameras, clerks, and maintenance logs sometimes do. A night manager remembers a face after a reward notice. A repair ticket records a first name and a phone number that still pings at a tower long enough to fix direction of travel. By early winter, the line on the map curved toward Florida. This was not a single eureka moment, but a series of small confirmations. A purchase consistent with RV supplies. A clerk who remembered Texas plates even if they could not recall a full number. A maintenance worker who had seen a man sleeping in a vehicle between rows of rigs. Each piece was checked, paired with timestamps when possible, and stacked against known distances a single driver could cover. It was enough to pivot resources. What this chapter should make plain is that the story didn't become a different story. The Marque homicide file drove every decision. The bolos, the marshal's bulletins, the interagency calls, everyone quoted the same charge and the same victim. Flight does not create a new narrative. It forces the original one into a larger arena. As December approached, a credible lead surfaced near Ocala. It referenced a specific RV park and a vehicle setup consistent with someone living out of a car while avoiding front desk logs. Law enforcement staged quietly. The plan was containment and arrest if the identification confirmed. The next development would end the search, or end the chance to bring the defendant into a courtroom at all. After the strap went dark and the Chevrolet Tahoe was taken at knife point, the case expanded across state lines but never split. Every lead that moved the search forward still pointed back to the Marque bathroom homicide and the pending Texas murder charge. With U.S. Marshals on the file, the strategy shifted from broad alerts to targeted pressure: confirm direction of travel, identify where a fugitive can sleep undisturbed, and stage for a quiet arrest. The first break was not dramatic. It was a purchase pattern. Financial analysis teams pulled lawful records connected to known identifiers and saw intermittent activity consistent with someone avoiding traceable routines. Small cash conversions, occasional fuel buys that did not repeat at the same stations, and supply purchases typically associated with vehicle living. None of it proved location by itself. In combination with highway camera hits on corridors heading east, it narrowed the map. You chase what you can verify, not what makes the best story. Detectives and marshals reviewed where people on the run choose to park, RV parks with month-to-month options, lots near interstates, and campgrounds with minimal ID checks rise to the top. Night managers and maintenance crews become key observers. They know which vehicles belong and which are just there at odd hours. The team circulated a tight bulletin, photographs, descriptors, caution notes, and contact instructions to sites along the likely route. The request was simple. If anyone saw a man sleeping in a vehicle or paying in cash off the books, call the listed number and say nothing else. Automated license plate reader returns came in waves. Some were clean, some were false positives. Where a hit aligned with a plausible time-distance calculation, local partners checked nearby cameras and asked business owners to preserve footage. If a return landed on a toll facility, subpoena clocks started. The goal was to stitch movement into a timeline measured in hours and exits, not in guesses. The Tahoe, once recovered, added its own evidence, but the search did not wait for full lab results. Field units moved on corroborated sightings. Lab units built the case the courtroom would require. The digital side was careful about phones. Fugitives who use their old numbers make tracking simple. Most do not. Investigators looked instead for short-lived activations and one-off calls placed near highway corridors. That produced leads and noise in equal measure. The test for inclusion was proof. Did the call detail records line up with the physical sightings and fuel receipts, or were they coincidence? Only the former went to the teams in cars. Victim services staff continued steady contact with Savannah Pascal's family. There were no predictions. They explained interstate coordination, the role of the marshals, and how a valid tip moves through the system. In towns like Marque, murders aren't just crimes, they change how a community breathes. Keeping families informed is not a courtesy, it is part of the public safety mission. By late December 2021, the map tightened around Central Florida. It wasn't one eureka moment, but a set of small confirmations. A clerk remembered Texas plates. A maintenance worker noted a man keeping to himself, sleeping in a vehicle tucked between rigs. A supply receipt matched the kind of items used to block window views. Each piece was logged with time and place, then checked against what a single driver could cover in a day. The line on the board ran toward Ocala. The operation plan was built for control, not speed. Surveillance would confirm identity, patrol would control the perimeter, and arrest would follow only when the risk to bystanders was minimal. The RV park on the list, quiet, near the highway, fit the pattern investigators had been tracking since spring. Teams staged unmarked units nearby and coordinated radio channels so the first call did not clog dispatch lines. A supervisor reviewed the prior Harris County contact where the defendant had been injured. The reminder mattered for officer safety, clear commands, patience, and distance. The night before New Year's Eve, the park's routine was predictable. Families in for the holidays, temporary workers keeping to themselves, and travelers sleeping early for a morning drive. That predictability was the point. You want a contained space where a person cannot exit without crossing eyes trained to see them. The plan called for verification first, a quiet visual check of the vehicle, a confirmation of the occupant, and one chance to take the person alive without a chase through a populated area. None of the investigators forgot why they were there. The Texas case file sat in the lead agent's car, pages marked at the autopsy summary, and the inventory sheets from the bathroom. A clean arrest would return the case to court where it belonged. A failed one might end it without a verdict. Everyone involved understood that difference. The call came from inside the park just before midnight on December 31, 2021. A staff member had seen a vehicle matching the bulletin parked in a space that wasn't on the normal roster. It had been there long enough to notice and not long enough to draw attention. Law enforcement moved to the perimeter. Units took positions that protected the nearest rows. Loud hailers were ready but silent. The plan depended on confirmation and patience. It was not a raid, it was a containment. That night would decide whether the Lamarque homicide moved forward by indictment and trial or ended on the perimeter of a Florida RV park. The team had done what they could: build the route with verifiable pieces, stage with caution, and keep the case a single continuous story: one victim, one charge, one file. On October 21, 2020, in Marque, Texas, Savannah Pascal was shot and killed in her bathroom. Her husband, Trent Pascal, was charged with her murder, arrested, and later released on bond with an ankle monitor. In April 2021, he cut off the device and fled. On December 31, 2021, police located him at an RV park in Ocala, Florida. As officers moved in, a single gunshot rang out from inside his vehicle. He had taken his own life before arrest. The Texas case was closed due to his death, with all evidence preserved for record. This case underscores that legal closure does not erase loss and highlights the urgent need for early intervention in domestic violence situations. Looking back on this case, I'm reminded how fragile life can be and how ignoring warning signs in relationships can end in tragedy. If you ever feel unsafe, please reach out for help. Your life matters, and walking away is not weakness, it's courage. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done in Savannah's place? If this video moved you, share where you're watching from and subscribe to follow more stories that truly matter.